Hi. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. We're going to be talking about reducing carbon-intensive activity, where we always have Paris. I'm Sam Gill. I'm the executive editor of China Dialogue, which is a bilingual website based in London and Beijing, which is focused on all climate change and environmental issues, with a special focus on China. It's been going around a decade, during which time we've seen enormous change in the global conversation around climate change, sustainable development, low carbon transition. Indeed, a sort of change from, I think, the questions of, are we going to see progress on this? Do governments get it? So really, how is that transition playing out on the ground? And I think we're getting much more into that sort of nitty-gritty conversation in this panel. And it's also a really interesting moment to be discussing it, given that right now we've got the Bonn conference going on, the UN climate conference hosted by Fiji, the first to be held since Trump announced his planned withdrawal from the Paris Agreement. A moment when, even if we are to meet the pledges under the current agreement, the so-called NDCs, the nationally determined contributions that countries have put forward to the UN, we are not at the level of ambition that could keep us to 2 or 1.5 degrees. We're, according to UNEP, we're probably on track for a 3-degree world, even if we were to meet those targets. Plus, we have this announced withdrawal from the Paris Agreement that means there's something of a leadership vacuum at the national government level. So the question becomes, where is that innovation going to come from? What are the sources of, the new sources of power, the new sources of sort of leverage that might scale up that ambition and might sort of unlock some of that innovation and so on that's needed? So I'm really pleased to have a very well-qualified panel to be talking about this here. We have, on the end, Javier Garcia-Martinez from the University of Alicante. We have Carlos Alvarez Pereira from the Anaxis Foundation, Mohan Munasinghe from Planeteers, Femke Grothaus from the X-Tax project, and Michael Kunt from the Collaborating Center on Sustainable Consumption and Production. And I wanted to open by asking everyone on the panel to say a little about themselves and just introduce sort of where they're coming from, but specifically to tell us something about how they see their work helping to regain some of that momentum and drive some of that ambition on climate in the absence of the sufficient level of leadership that we need to get where we need to go, sort of post-Paris. So maybe starting with Javier on the end.
Well, thank you, Sam. It's a pleasure to be here today. So what I do mainly is I do research. I apply nanotechnology to make materials that are more efficient in the energy space, both in oil refining and hydrogen and solar cells. So we have a very broad spectrum of technologies that we work with. I also founded my own company when I was at MIT. So I am a big believer of academic entrepreneurs, really bridging the gap between academia and industry. And my main message today is that, in my opinion, there is this magical belief, which is actually quite irresponsible, that the technologies will keep coming somehow. But we are not putting the resources, neither the comprehensive plan for these technologies to come. And this needs to come from public-private partnerships. So if we want to get negative emissions, if we want to create jobs and opportunities, this is going to come from technology. And we have two different narratives. Ones are consumers or policies or very complicated international deals. And then we have all the scientists and the entrepreneurs where they feel isolated from these dialogues. And there is a lot of money involved in these climate deals. If just a little bit of the taxes or the agreements will go to have the only, because there is nothing like that, an international fund to support innovation in the energy field, it will be transformative.
Carlos?
Yes, I would like to, very much in line with you asked for more ambition, and in line with what you said, I would like to open a little bit the framework. Because I think humans, we are very good at denial with bad news, and we are still very much in denial. We still hear the idea, we heard that at the opening ceremony here of the WebSummit, that climate change is just a collateral damage of something which went well otherwise. And I think this framework is too narrow. No, it's not a collateral damage, it's a structural feature of our development system, of our economy has been conceived and the development model has been conceived. So actually, we have been not taking into account for many, many years, decades, not to say centuries, the negative externalities of our development model. That has not been taken into account in the accounting. So for instance, one of the gridlocks we have is that we think we have a lot of wealth. We have built up a lot of wealth, which is to a large extent fake, because it did not take into account those negative externalities. So we have to take this more systemic, holistic perspective to say, well, sorry, but we will have to do regarding climate change, but not only, we will have to do a massive write-off, which will happen anyway in tragic manners or in a more structured way. But we will have to do that write-off to give a chance to imagination, to come with many different kinds of tools, but without that write-off, it will not happen. I think from a systemic perspective, this is a big, big challenge, a challenge we are not able yet to understand, which is the challenge of how do we create high levels of well-being with low ecological footprint, not only carbon footprint, but ecological footprint, which is wider. And for that, we will need tons of imagination and to act at very different leverage points of the system. And I think in the panel, we have good examples of leverage, of actions which can be made at different leverage points, but in an holistic perspective. By the way, imagination could have prevented the whole thing, if the systemic conditions were met at the beginning, because I don't know if you are aware, but the first operational solar machines were developed in 1850s, in the 1850s. So more than a century and a half ago. And still today we don't use solar energy as the main source of energy.
Mohan, where are we going to find ambition?
Thank you, Simon. First, I've been working on poverty and sustainable and development and climate change issues for 40 years, more than the age of many of the people at the forum. So there is a kind of a deja vu in what I have to say. I echo some of the sentiments made earlier. First is that climate change cannot be looked at in isolation. It's part of the sustainable issues range that we face, including poverty. So we need an integrated approach and integrated solutions, and they are available. It is just lack of leadership at the very top level that is and a failure of implementation or lack of political will. And this is where I think some of the proposals made as far back as 1992 at the Rio Earth Summit, where I presented, among others, a framework called Sustainomics. Some of the principles are still very valid. I mean, one of them which now is trotted out is under people, planet, and profits or prosperity, is the old sustainable development triangle, which I presented: economy, environment, and society, that we have to have those in balance in order to go towards sustainable development. We have to have a stakeholder triangle. It's not only governments who have failed to deliver solutions, but also business, which is very well represented in this forum, plus civil society, all working together. We also have to have a kind of an incremental approach, in a sense, which I call making development more sustainable. It's like climbing a mountain that in order to get to the peak, you take one step at a time. But a lot of the things that we need to do are pretty obvious, and we can do it ourselves. We have to empower ourselves. When we leave the room, we switch off a light, we turn off a tap, we plant a tree. People forget that they are kind of dazzled by technology and looking for big solutions. Sometimes, as if Schumacher said, small is beautiful. Individual actions, empowerment, particularly through civil society, is as important as the technology. I would also add that the recent thing which I've worked on is something called the balanced, inclusive green growth pathway. It's a sustainable development triangle because inclusive means society, green means environment, growth means the economy. But there are very practical policy tools available to do that. And technology and you, all of you out there, have a very important role. But you have to understand how this path can be an expressway to sustainable development if we follow it. Otherwise, as was said earlier, we're kind of flailing away, and even the pledges now for climate, we're heading towards a 3-degree world, not 1.5, not even 2. And when developing country leaders ask me, I tell them, look, your first thing is adapt, because whatever you do or whatever everybody else does, there is going to be some climate change. Protect your poor. Okay? So it's that kind of grim situation. We need the innovation to break out of this. And in a sense, my generation has not done so well, but I'm looking at the bright young faces, and I think it's going to be your world. You have to solve the problem. One last point, I mean, one of the things that has energized me here is the buzz that you feel. It's a kind of a frenetic energy, but I would caution and also say you need focus, that this energy has to be focused in order to solve the problem. So that is something that you need to cultivate. We can talk more about it later. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Femke.
Thank you. My name is Femke Groothuis. I'm president of the XTEX project, and we look at the role of tax in the transition to circular economies and inclusive economies. And I'm quite hopeful because Paris has set something in motion, right? It's going to be unstoppable, even though we need to step up much more. But businesses are actually playing a role in that as well. They are stepping up. Almost 90% of global business, big corporations, have carbon reduction targets. Dozens of companies have joined the RE100 renewable energy commitment. And more than 1,300 businesses are including in their books a fictitious or self-imposed carbon tax, expecting governments to act soon and pollution not being free anymore in future. They are anticipating this future. And the only thing is that businesses cannot do this alone. And I might quote Paul Polman, the CEO of Unilever, who said, companies cannot do this alone. Internal carbon prices can only be sustained if that price materializes in the real economy through policies that create a level playing field. And that's a very good point, because taxes on natural resource use are very low in our societies, and 75% of carbon emissions are currently unpriced, so they're tax-free, they're free of charge. And we're even subsidizing pollution, of course. And then, on the other hand, labor taxes are very high. Government budgets lean very heavily on labor taxes, social contributions, personal income tax, payroll taxes. And for entrepreneurs, this is a barrier to shift their business models from the linear take, make, waste economy into circular business models that include reuse, recycling, repair, remanufacturing, but also all the R&D that's necessary, all the innovation that's going to be necessary to redesign our supply chains and our products and services. So our tax system is actually holding back entrepreneurs to save carbon, to decarbonize, but also to offer the products and services that fit that low carbon economy, but also a low resource economy, but a high inclusive economy that requires, the output, the creativity of all of us. And with our research partners, we look at possibilities to use the revenues of carbon taxes, but also other resource use taxes on water, etc., metals and minerals, energy, to lower the tax burden on labor in order to enable businesses to shift their models. And we've had our scenario modeled by Cambridge Econometrics, and the results are stunning. It's a pro-growth, pro-business, pro-jobs plan. So really, there is no reason not to shift. And the title of this session was something about wiping billions off the profits of businesses, but it's not about that. It's about shifting financial incentives so businesses who are polluters will pay, and the ones who create jobs, benefit and can grow and scale up. Indeed, the global goals, and that's such a fascinating thing about it, they marry the environmental side and the social side. And to me, taxes are the fabric in between. If we don't fix our fiscal systems, then the drivers are totally the opposite way. So it's very rewarding to work on that. I invite you all to contribute if you want, or to join our research. And to look at how we can create a type of economic growth that is inclusive, that provides opportunities for people that we have in abundance in the world today to use their talents and their capabilities rather than extracting natural resources and pollution. So that's a different growth model, and technology can play a role, but we do need to fix the level playing field between man and machine, so we can have technology and humanity work side by side and support it for this inclusive growth.
Michael, thanks. I'm coming in with a bit more people-centric view. So what I actually would call for is people-centric innovation processes. And I go back what Mohan said about the focus. I feel if I go around here, there's lots of good innovation happening. But the question is, where do you focus on? And one idea and one focus I would have is be people-centric. Try to understand what are the social challenges, try to understand who is not included today, and try to get an innovation process happening which includes those people, which is trying to solve some of the social challenges. And I'm saying this because I don't think this is happening out there. I work also with the corporate world, I work also with governments. I've been working in Bhutan on gross national happiness, trying to get an investment policy for Bhutan right, that investors invest into happiness. And for me, this was a very important part of the equation because it asked a lot of people questions. So when are people happy? What makes them happy? What are the criteria for being happy? And how can you invest, how can you innovate into this? And I'm saying this also because I see lots of challenges, environmental and social ones. Let's take the food system. We waste 40% of the food and it's never eaten. So this is a tremendous opportunity to jump into it and innovate about it. We produce textiles, and 30% of the textiles never enter to the consumer stage. They are burned after a certain period of time because the next collection might be out of fashion or you don't generate money with it. So it also, and then you look on textiles in terms which we wear, and only 5% is really recycled. It comes into circular economy perspective. And these are just some of the challenges I see, and there are all people behind. People who manufacture it, people who wear it, people who use it, people who steer a governance framework around it. And I think it needs more this type of consumer-based insights. So for example, I'm trying to install at corporate level lifestyle manager. I discuss with corporate entities, how can you bring 100% sustainability to your organization? Not 5%, not 3%, not greenwashing, not a bit pilot project, but how can you make your organization 100% sustainable? And what it take for you? And then actually you need to start which people you have in the organization, what contracts do you have with your supply chain, what contracts you have with your employees. Are they inspired to look onto CO2 reduction? Are you looking into sustainability from a contractual perspective also with your employees, with your supplier? And I think there is quite a bit of opportunity space in this area. And one other issue I have, if I look on this meeting here, I'm not sure if it's an equal representation. I feel we run into the next revolution of building a new infrastructure. And I'm not sure where civil society organizations are there. Do they discuss this? Do they know about it? Can we invite them to discuss those issues which are just happening as we speak? And again, maybe get also the people-centric mindset into the innovation process. So just some insights.
Absolutely. So it seems there's an enormous scale of transformation needed in the real economy. Everyone seems to be agreed that we have enormous technological challenges facing us in terms of, for example, the Javier mentioned the scale of negative emissions technologies that would be part of any emissions budget that keep us on track for Paris targets, and the need to scale renewable energy to shift away from coal. And all of this needs to be underpinned by quite a different type of economic structure. So looking for actually where there might be some disagreement in the sort of pathways for how we get there. I'm interested actually in the role of the state versus markets and different sorts of instruments that could help. And I noted, Javier, that you talked, for example, about the role for public-private partnerships and R&D from companies. But from my perspective, innovation and innovation breakthroughs, when they've occurred, have always been driven by massive public investment, by a state that is willing to really back these kind of moonshot-type projects. Yeah. Can we really see the kind of level of transformation investment in innovation that we need without that level of state, national, public investment?
Well, I think that is the mistake, that we are still thinking about national investment. I was talking about international efforts. If we can agree on taxes, if we can agree about reducing CO2 emissions, how we cannot agree on a big international fund to support the kind of technologies that we need? Again, it's magical thinking to believe that this technology will come. But in the labs, and mainly funded by national grants, very minor, very small in scale, we have technologies now like artificial photosynthesis, which is taking CO2 from the atmosphere and converting that into solar fuels. We have CO2 used as a raw material to make plastics. We have data that proves that CO2 can be reduced to fuels with hydrogen. So all these technologies in a very early stage are in all these different universities and national labs waiting for an international fund on research for energy. I'm very happy reducing labor taxes. That's fine. But I'm worried next time government is going to need a little bit more of cash, that is going to increase that taxes again. So a very good and very effective way to make use of the revenue from taxes is to create an international fund, so we will not have the problem of national governments not investing enough. We have a big chunk of money for this. And then on the private sector, I think that is the main obstacle here. If we see the figures, how much of the revenue from the big corporation is invested in R&D? Tiny. And in real R&D, tiny. And in real R&D for reducing CO2 emissions, non-existent. So this fund that I am advocating for, it should come not only from taxes, not only from national science foundations, but also from companies that should chip in this effort that is not going to come just from universities. It needs to come from everybody. And finally, the main obstacle, in my opinion, is that these big energy corporations are so big in the marketplace that there is no room for entrepreneurs. We cannot compete with the big guys because the states have all the laws and all the systems to protect the big corporations. Of course, they need resources and stability and whatever reasons we can think of for the big corporations to benefit from the state. But if there is no room for real competition in the energy sector, how the energy entrepreneurs can create new companies that are going to make a difference? So again, that's the role for private partnerships.
Emke, you wanted to jump in here?
Yeah, I'd like to respond. So I've worked for an impact investment fund for nine years, investing in sustainable and social businesses. And what I've learned is that for them to have a business case, pricing matters. So you can invest, but only if there's profitability at the end of the line, it will draw up investment.
Of course.
So changing the financial incentives is so fundamental, because you can't invest in a technology that is brought into a world where labor taxes are so high that there's no business case, or there's free pollution, and if you want to substitute carbon emissions and there's no price on carbon, it's very hard to make a business case because of the effort and the brains that go into developing new technologies. So for there to be a surge of investment in clean technology, it's so fundamental that we shift financial incentives for entrepreneurs to move from focusing their creative force on reducing headcount and creating technologies to achieve that, towards creating technologies that actually solve big problems that we have, and to sort of free up, to unleash this power. We do need to change financial incentives as well.
Mohan, you wanted to jump in?
Just to react to the flow of conversation, just let me encapsulate the urgency of the problem we face. I always give this example. If you look at the ecological footprint of humanity, which is a concept of how much resources we use, we're already using about 1.7 times what the planet can sustainably support. By 2030, we will need 2 planets worth, right? Who is doing the consuming? 85% of the consumption is done by the richest 1.4 billion people. So I've asked this question from world leaders, much to their embarrassment in many fora. If the rich are already consuming more than 1 planet worth, and this is not just climate, it means all of the resources, minerals, food, water, energy. Where are the resources to help bring the poor out of poverty? We are every day promising to raise them out of poverty. So it's very urgent. But I agree that prices and taxes are very important as a short-run tool to get the thing moving, right? So, but we have to be clever. I mean, we have to think of revenue-neutral taxation, because people don't want more taxes. So if we take tax resources, then we must give back on labor, something like that. But it can be done. There are clever systems to do that. But then there are also disruptive technologies. I mean, if robots come and replace human beings, do you tax the robots or not? So it's not easy, but it can be done. We have other methods which also work in the medium term. I represent Planeteers in a sense. Planeteers is a very clever way of bringing sustainable consumers and sustainable producers together in the web, on the web, okay? Which is a very difficult thing to do so far, because there are many people who are sustainable or potentially sustainable who don't know where to go or what to do. And this is a way of doing that. And all tribute to Planeteers for doing that. Now, I would also not neglect the longer term, because you mentioned, I think, the concept of happiness, that the whole economic system is driving us to more consumption, because GNP actually measures production, right? But I have worked on concept of gross national happiness, for example, with the Kingdom of Bhutan. And we all know happiness doesn't come only from more consumption. Of course, if you're very poor, you need to raise your level of consumption. But for most of us who are better off, we need more leisure, more time with family, friends, and so on. So we have to shift what is our model of success or good. And that value change has to happen very fundamentally. From the lower stage, I look at my grandchildren, and that's where we have to start, and it will take a long time. Whether we have enough time is another matter, because we are at the edge of a cliff here, right? And either we fall off and millions of people will die, and then, or we can move away from the cliff and go to safety. Either way, change will come, okay? And just to finish off, I think the question of focus also is extremely important. If I have a last minute thing, I will say more about that, how you can find greater focus.
So we only have another 3 minutes or so to transform the global economy and solve climate change. And I'll give it first to Carlos, whose specialty, as I understand it, is in the governance of complex systems. So these chaotic systems with all kinds of complex dynamics. So I thought maybe you could jump in about actually how do you how do you bring about transitions in context of such highly disruptive, dynamic forces?
Yeah, and connecting with the point you made about state versus markets, which is not the dilemma. One of the points I would like to make is that we don't have a dilemma about state versus the markets, because both need the others to exist. States, companies, and other types of human organizations exist in society in more or less harmonic ways, but they are part of an ecosystem, of a social ecosystem integrating also nature. And what we have to look at is at the processes, at the dynamics of how those organizations, those human organizations are acting, and under which rules. So, for instance, businesses operate under rules which are defined by the community at a political level. So we have to reclaim politics. And if we don't change the rules, as, for instance, Femke was pointing out, if we don't change the rules for businesses in the ways businesses operate, they will continue in the same logic they are in, which is the real dilemma, to change the logic from a logic which corresponds, in my view, wrongly, but anyway, it corresponds to a long period where we thought the world was empty, and we could afford to, we could imagine, we took the assumption that the nature would accept and absorb all our externalities. Now we know, and we know very dramatically, that the world is more than full. We are about needing 2 planets to live. So the world is more than full, so we have to change completely the name of the game. Forget about unlimited growth without taking into account externalities, to a more qualitative game.
Michael?
And maybe just in addition, because there's nothing I can disagree with you, but in addition, I would also call for public-private people partnership. And again, why I'm saying this, because I think, ask yourself what inspires you. Is it a global dimension, global goals, or is it something within your street, within your family, within your city? So I think beyond all this complexity we have to see that lots of things can happen at the city level. At the local level, we need to see the people-driven processes there and understand there are a lot of competing goals. If you just go in a local community and you work with them, you will see there are topics on being inclusive, there are topics being about unemployment, and there is also a topic about CO2 emission. But it's competing with one in each other. But still, you can find guys at the local level who are inspired about it. And then you can ask yourself, how do you get a financial system going which maybe supports those local activities? And that can be, for example, also local banks. We have tried to establish a rhythm with some local banks being responsible about local development processes as well, trying to inspire people here financially to go on with the social challenges, the environmental challenges they feel. Second, I think we talk in the CO2 arena a lot about the emission itself. I would always call also for embedded emission. So we need to find a low-carbon banana, a low-carbon coffee, as in addition to all those other activities we are having. And I think there is little attention on it yet. But look on your consumption patterns overall, and you will see many products you consume are full of CO2 emission. And the question is, would you find a low-carbon banana? Probably not yet, but we need to develop one.
So bringing it back to that question of lifestyle and consumption and the people-centric approach that we need. I'm afraid we've run out of time, but it's been a fantastic conversation, and please join me in thanking the panel.